My name is Tegan Sloan. I'm 32 years old, and I work as an accountant outside Philadelphia. On Mother's Day, my mother did not call me a disappointment in private. She bought ink for it. That morning, while most people were posting flowers and smiling family pictures, my neighbor Arthur Hollis walked up my front path holding our local paper like it contained something poisonous. He did not make small talk. He just handed it to me and waited. Across an entire page was my mother's public apology for raising a failure, and that failure was me. My pay stubs were laid out like proof. Old report cards were printed like I was on trial for the person I used to be. My credit score was there. So was the address of the little house I had fought hard to buy after rebuilding my life from scratch. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, I understood something that made me strangely calm. This was not a moment of anger. Anger is sloppy. This was organized, deliberate, and approved by the people who were supposed to love me most. What my mother did not know when she paid for that full newspaper page was that she had finally crossed the one line that could never be uncrossed. Cruelty inside a family can be explained away. It can be disguised as concern, discipline, or tough love. But once you print it for an entire town to read over breakfast, it becomes evidence, and evidence has a way of changing everything. So before you decide whether I was too cold for what happened next, keep listening, because the page my mother bought to humiliate me was the same page that started the downfall of my whole family. For as long as I can remember, my family treated my life like a cautionary tale that had not happened yet, only one they were sure would. My mother had built her whole identity around the idea of family legacy. She ran a catering business that handled weddings, charity luncheons, retirement parties, church banquets, any event where polished silver, perfect centerpieces, and the right guest list could make people feel important. She believed the business was more than income. To her, it was proof that the Sloan family meant something in our town. My older sister fit into that world like she had been born for it. She loved attention, loved being remembered, loved walking into a room and acting like she owned the air inside it. By the time we were teenagers, she was already helping with tasting tables, favor displays, vendor meetings, anything that let her stand beside our mother and shine. I was different from the beginning. I liked order, numbers, structure, and quiet. I liked knowing where money went, why people made bad decisions, how small choices turned into big consequences. When I was 15, my mother decided it was time for me to start learning the business too. She said one daughter would handle the people and one daughter would handle the books, and together we would carry the family name forward. It sounded beautiful when she said it out loud. It also felt like a trap the second it landed on me. I told her I did not want that life. I wanted college. I wanted my own career. I wanted to build something that belonged to me, not inherit something that came with strings tied around my throat. She never forgave me for that answer. After that, everything in our house became a comparison I could never win. If my sister worked a 12-hour event, my mother praised her loyalty. If I stayed up studying, I was accused of acting superior. If my sister made people smile, she was called warm and gifted. If I kept to myself, I was cold, difficult, and ungrateful. My father almost never started the attacks, but he never stopped them either. He sat there at dinner, nodded at the right moments, laughed when my mother made little comments about my future, and treated silence like innocence. When I left for college, my mother acted like I had deserted the family during a war. When I got my accounting degree, she called it a piece of paper that taught me how to count other people's money while turning my back on my own blood. When my marriage fell apart in my 20s, she did not say she was sorry. She said that was what happened when women tried too hard to be independent. The worst part was that my life was not falling apart. It never gave her the proof she wanted. I worked hard, paid my bills, repaired my credit after the divorce, bought a small house, built a retirement account, and made a life that was stable, calm, and honest. But in my family, stability did not matter if it was not flashy enough to impress people. I was not a disaster, and maybe that offended them even more, because I had done exactly what they said I could not do. I had built a life without needing their approval, and they never stopped punishing me for it. The newspaper ad would have been ugly enough on its own, but my family was not interested in ordinary humiliation. They wanted reach. They wanted witnesses. They wanted the kind of shame that keeps moving long after the first shock wears off. A few hours after Arthur brought me the paper, I found out my mother had not acted alone. My father had gone out and bought 100 extra copies like he was stocking up for a celebration. He mailed them to relatives, old family friends, people from church, men from his golf club, and a few local business contacts who had known our family for years. He even included handwritten notes in some of the envelopes, as if he were sending out holiday cards instead of a public execution of his own daughter. By noon, the story was already moving through the town exactly the way they wanted. Phones were buzzing. Neighbors were pretending not to stare. People who had not spoken to me in years suddenly knew my salary, my divorce, my credit score, and where I lived. Then it got worse. I got a message from someone I used to know saying, "You should see what your sister did." I drove over to Vaughn and Vine, my sister Cassidy's shop, and there it was, hanging in a frame near the front register where every customer checking out would have to see it. My mother's full-page apology sat under glass like it was something worth preserving, and beneath it was a printed caption in neat script that said, "Don't end up like my sister." Cassidy had turned my humiliation into decor. She had made it part of the brand. I stood there for a second watching women browse candles and ribboned gift boxes while that page hung behind the counter like a warning sign. One of the employees noticed me and immediately looked away. That was the moment I understood this was not one cruel decision made in anger. This was a coordinated family effort. My mother wrote the wound, my father distributed it, and my sister displayed it like a trophy. By the time I got back to my car, I had 3 missed calls from numbers I did not recognize, and 1 email from work asking me to stop by my supervisor's office the next morning. My family had not just tried to embarrass me in public. They had pushed my private life into my job, my safety, and every corner of the town I had spent years trying to quietly survive in. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself how they could do this to me. I started asking a better question. How much did they have to lose once everyone saw who they really were? The next morning, I walked into the office expecting pity, judgment, or one of those careful corporate conversations where people pretend they are being kind, while quietly deciding you are now a liability. Instead, Pamela Sutton closed her office door, slid a large envelope across her desk, and said, "I thought you should see exactly what was sent here." Inside was one of the newspaper copies along with a handwritten note from my father. He had addressed it to a senior partner by name and framed the whole thing as an act of concern. He wrote that my employer deserved to know who they had trusted with financial records, that I had a history of poor judgment, that my personal life proved I was unstable, and that my family was bravely trying to tell the truth before I embarrassed the firm. It was so polished, so self-righteous, and so viciously calm that for a second I just stared at the page and felt something in me go very still. Pamela watched me read it, then told me my work spoke for itself, and that no one in the building was confusing cruelty with credibility. I thanked her, asked if I could photograph everything, and took pictures of the envelope, the note, the postmark, and every page they had sent. I did it carefully, the same way I documented financial discrepancies or irregular filings. By the time I finished, I was no longer reacting as a daughter. I was thinking like an accountant. Evidence mattered. Timing mattered. Patterns mattered. And my family had just handed me all 3. What they did not know was that I had spent years noticing things they assumed I would never connect. I knew my mother's catering company looked successful from the outside, but I also knew appearances in business could be expensive costumes. A lot of her larger events depended on one licensed commercial kitchen she did not own. Without that kitchen, she could not legally prep for the volume that kept her business alive. I also knew the property was in a redevelopment zone and that the landlord had been under pressure to sell. My sister's store looked charming and busy, but I knew a big chunk of her revenue came from 3 corporate clients who placed repeat seasonal orders large enough to make the rest of the shop look stronger than it really was. And my mother's standing in town was tied to more than money. She needed admiration the way other people needed oxygen. The women's group at church, the charity committees, the polished image of being the devoted mother who held everyone together, those things fed her just as much as her business did. I had seen all of it for years and done nothing with it, because I still believed there should be some line families do not cross. Now that line was gone. I did not storm into anyone's house. I did not call and threaten them. I did not cry in the parking lot or ask why. I just went back to my desk, finished my work, and started organizing what I knew. Because the truth was, my family had mistaken my silence for weakness for most of my life. What it had actually been was restraint. And once restraint no longer made sense, all that was left was strategy. My mother came to my house 3 days later carrying a glass dish covered with foil, like we were about to have a normal family conversation. It was pasta bake, the kind she used to bring to church potlucks when she wanted compliments on how generous she was. She stood on my porch with that careful, wounded expression people use when they know they have done something unforgivable, but still want credit for showing up. The first thing she said was, not, "I'm sorry." It was, "You know why I did it." That told me everything. She walked into my kitchen, set the dish down, and started talking like the newspaper page had been an intervention instead of a public humiliation campaign. She said she had been trying to wake me up for years. She said I had become detached, prideful, too private, too convinced that a quiet little life was the same thing as a meaningful one. She called the ad tough love. She said sometimes shame was the only thing strong enough to break denial. I asked her what exactly I was in denial about. Paying my bills on time? Owning my home? Having a stable job? Not asking anyone in my family for money? She hated that question because it forced her to say out loud what this had always really been about. I had chosen a life she did not control, and she had never forgiven me for it. When I mentioned the copies mailed to my office, she tried to shift blame immediately. She said your father got carried away. She said Cassidy was emotional. She said the whole thing grew bigger than she intended. But that was the lie people like my mother always tell when consequences start forming on the horizon. They want ownership of the cruelty while it feels powerful. Then suddenly it becomes everybody else's misunderstanding once the damage circles back. Later that same evening, my father showed up and somehow managed to make the whole thing even uglier. He did not bring food or apologies. He came angry, not ashamed, not shaken, angry. He said people at the club had started asking questions and that I needed to put a stop to the gossip before it hurt the family any more than it already had. I remember staring at him and thinking how amazing it was that a man could help mail 100 copies of an attack on his own daughter and still talk like he was the one being victimized. He wanted me to call a few people, smooth things over, tell them it had all been exaggerated, maybe even laugh it off so everyone could move on. Move on from what? From my address being printed in the paper? From my marriage being dragged back into public like a failed exhibit? From my own family trying to turn me into a moral lesson for strangers? That night, after he left, I got a call from my Aunt Lorraine Abbott. She had always been the one person in the family who saw things without dressing them up. She did not defend what my mother had done. She also did not act surprised by it. She told me there was something I deserved to understand, even if it would not excuse any of this. When my mother was 18, her older sister left home for college and never came back in any real way. She built a career, married into another world, and kept the family at arm's length after that. My grandmother took it hard, but my mother took it personally. In her mind, education had stolen her sister. Success had made her ashamed of where she came from, and independence had become another word for abandonment. Lorraine said that when I chose college over the family business, my mother did not see a daughter trying to build her own future. She saw history repeating itself. She saw rejection all over again. I listened quietly, and for a moment I did understand her better than I ever had. But understanding is not the same thing as absolution. Plenty of people are wounded and do not turn that wound into a weapon. Plenty of mothers are disappointed and do not print their daughter's private information in a newspaper. My mother had a pain she never healed, and instead of facing it, she spent 17 years punishing me for reminding her it existed. By the time I hung up with Aunt Lorraine, I felt something I had not felt since this started. Not softness, not forgiveness, just clarity. My mother's cruelty was not random. It had roots. It had history. It had a story she had probably told herself for years to justify every comparison, every insult, every little act of humiliation she dressed up as concern. But at the end of the day, it was still a choice. And once I saw that clearly, I stopped waiting for guilt to save any of them. By the following week, everything my family had set in motion was beginning to move back toward them. I did not rush it. I did not make threats. I did not post a single vague sentence online for sympathy. I simply stopped protecting people who had never protected me. A few years earlier, one of the firms I worked with had handled financial records tied to the property where my mother leased her commercial kitchen. I had never been directly involved in the real estate side, but I knew enough to understand what was coming. The building was part of a redevelopment plan, and tenants with short-term leases were already living on borrowed time. My mother's company depended on that licensed kitchen far more than most people realized. Without it, she could still pretend to be in business for a little while, but she could not legally prepare food at the scale her wedding and corporate events required. She would be reduced to small trays and borrowed space, which in her world was the same thing as decline. I said nothing. I did not owe advance warning to the woman who had printed my home address for 35,000 strangers to read over breakfast. At the same time, I began having a few very careful conversations. Not dramatic ones, not manipulative ones, just honest ones with the right people. One of them was with a former client contact who had known me long enough to trust my judgment. Another was with someone whose company had ordered branded gift packages from Cassidy's store every holiday season for years. I never asked anyone to punish my family. I simply told the truth when I was asked why I seemed distracted. I said my mother had taken out a full-page newspaper ad to publicly apologize for raising me. I said my father had mailed copies to my workplace. I said my sister had framed the article and hung it in her shop under a sign that read, "Don't end up like my sister." Then I let silence do its work. People do not need much help drawing conclusions when the facts are ugly enough on their own. Within days, one corporate client postponed a large order with Cassidy's shop. Another started reviewing alternate vendors. A third sent someone into Vaughn and Vine to check whether the framed article was really still hanging there. It was. Cassidy, being Cassidy, refused to take it down because doing that would have felt like admitting she had done something shameful. She thought stubbornness looked like strength. What it actually looked like was bad judgment. And clients notice bad judgment when their own brand reputation is attached to it. The church fallout started quietly and then spread all at once. A woman from the fellowship group called my mother to ask if the newspaper page was real. Another wanted to know why private financial information had been made public. Someone else asked whether the family had considered how dangerous it was to publish a woman's address. Those were not questions my mother could charm her way around. She could act polished at a fundraiser. She could act gracious over a luncheon table. But there is no elegant version of explaining why you turned your daughter into a public warning sign. Soon she was missing informal planning meetings she normally controlled. Then she was left off an email chain for an outreach event. Then one of her closest friends from church stopped returning calls. My father, meanwhile, started getting the kind of polite but pointed comments men throw at each other when they want to judge without sounding emotional. At the club, someone joked that mailing out 100 copies of your daughter's humiliation was one way to stay busy in retirement. Another man asked if everything at home was all right in a tone that made it clear he already knew the answer was no. My father came home furious, but not at himself, at my mother. He accused her of pushing too hard. She shot back that none of this would be happening if he had not turned her ad into a distribution campaign. Cassidy blamed both of them for dragging her store into it. My mother blamed Cassidy for making it visible in the shop. Watching it unfold from a distance, I realized something almost funny. For the first time in years, they were treating each other exactly the way they had always treated me. Every problem had to be someone else's fault. Every consequence had to belong to the nearest person. Every ugly choice had to be repackaged as a justified reaction. The only difference was that now I was no longer standing in the middle of it for them to point at. And once they lost that target, they began turning on one another. That was when I knew the real collapse had started. Not when people talked, not when clients hesitated, not even when church friends pulled away. It started the moment my family could no longer hold their story together, because the truth was finally stronger than the performance. And once that happens, everything built on image begins to crack. 2 weeks later, the first official notice arrived. My mother's commercial kitchen lease was not being renewed. The property had been approved for redevelopment, and the tenants were being cleared out in stages. Under normal circumstances, that kind of news would have been stressful, but manageable. A business owner with time, good relationships, and a stable reputation could have scrambled, found temporary space, scaled down, negotiated, adapted. My mother had none of those advantages anymore. She had spent the past several weeks burning through goodwill like it was disposable. Venues were suddenly less flexible with her. A couple of long-time event contacts stopped returning calls. One bride asked directly if this was the same Marianne Sloan whose daughter had been humiliated in the paper. Another client quietly canceled before a charity gala because they did not want drama attached to their donor list. Once the kitchen was gone, the illusion collapsed fast. My mother could not fulfill the larger events that kept her business profitable. She could not prep legally at the scale she needed. She could not move production into some borrowed church kitchen without people noticing the downgrade. Within a month, she was refunding deposits, losing bookings, and quietly shutting down the catering company she had built her whole identity around. She did not just lose income. She lost the one thing she had spent years holding over me as proof that her life had more value than mine. Cassidy lasted a little longer, but not by much. The 3 corporate clients who had made her store look successful all pulled back in different ways. One cut ties immediately. One finished out a smaller order and never renewed. One sent a formal note saying they were moving in another direction and wished her the best. For a store like Vaughn and Vine, that was not a temporary inconvenience. That was the floor disappearing. Corporate orders had paid for the polished displays, the extra staff, the seasonal overstock, the look of abundance she loved so much. Once those contracts were gone, the shop started thinning out in a way no amount of attitude could hide. A part-time employee was let go first. Then the weekday hours were shortened. Then one afternoon I passed by and saw the framed newspaper article was gone from the wall, but by then it did not matter. People already knew. That was the funny thing about public humiliation. Once you release it into the world, you do not get to call it back when it stops serving you. My father did not lose a business, but in some ways his punishment fit him best. He lost ease. He lost his comfortable place in every room he entered. He lost the version of himself that believed he could quietly support cruelty and still be seen as a decent man because he had not been the loudest person in the family. People remembered that he had bought the extra papers. People remembered that he had mailed them. People remembered the neat little handwritten notes, the way he had tried to turn malice into civic concern. Men at the club stopped slapping him on the back. Conversations with neighbors became shorter. Invitations dried up. He was not cast out in one dramatic moment. He was simply no longer treated like a man people respected. For someone like my father, that kind of social death is its own punishment. And then came the apologies. Not the kind that heal. Not the kind built from remorse. The kind people offer when they are standing in the ashes of their own choices and suddenly need access to your mercy. My mother came first. She cried. She said she had gone too far. She said she had been under pressure. She said she had only wanted to shock me into changing before my life slipped away. Then, without even realizing it, she revealed the truth she still could not stop clinging to. She said if I had warned her about the kitchen, none of this would have happened. As if I had owed strategic protection to the woman who turned my private life into a public spectacle. Cassidy said the store never should have been dragged into family business, which would have been almost believable if she had not framed the article and hung it under a caption meant to humiliate me for customers. My father said we had all made mistakes, and it was time to move forward, which was his favorite way of pretending damage did not need accountability if enough time had passed. I listened to all of them. I let every word land. And then I told them no. No, I would not help them rebuild relationships they had destroyed on purpose. No, I would not tell people it had all been misunderstood. No, I would not comfort them, because the consequences had become heavier than they expected. And no, I did not owe forgiveness just because they finally understood pain when it belonged to them. I told my mother something she should have understood 17 years earlier. Love that depends on obedience is not love. Respect that disappears when a child chooses a different path is not respect. And public humiliation is not parenting, no matter how many times you dress it up as concern, honesty, or tough love. My family spent years treating my life like a warning. In the end, they became one. They lost the business, the clients, the image, the social standing, the version of themselves they thought could survive any amount of cruelty as long as it was aimed at me. What destroyed them was not revenge in the dramatic way people imagine it. I did not forge anything, steal anything, or lie about anything. I just stopped standing between them and the consequences of who they were. That is the part people never talk about when they excuse cruelty inside families. They think blood will always buy them one more chance, one more explanation, one more rescue. But there comes a point when protecting people from the results of their own choices is just another way of agreeing to be hurt. I had done enough of that for one lifetime, so I walked away. I kept my job. I kept my house. I kept the quiet life they mocked because it was never empty, only peaceful. And for the first time since I was 15, I stopped feeling like the defective version of someone else's daughter. I became exactly who I had fought to be. If there is any lesson in what happened, it is this. Family should never make you earn basic dignity by becoming a version of yourself they can show off. A parent's unresolved wounds do not give them the right to turn a child into a target. And the moment someone uses love as permission to shame, control, or publicly break you, they are no longer protecting the family. They are destroying it from the inside. My mother bought a full newspaper page to apologize for raising a failure. Weeks later, she lost her company. My sister lost her business. My father lost his standing. and all three of them finally had to sit in the truth they had printed for me first. I was never the failure. I was just the only one in that family who understood that dignity matters more than performance, and some lines, once crossed, cost everything. At Revenge Argonne, our team is committed to creating meaningful, engaging fictional stories that entertain while also sharing thoughtful lessons and educational value with our viewers. Every story on this channel is fictional and carefully crafted to inspire reflection, spark discussion, and deliver useful life messages. The villains in this story were especially disturbing because they hid cruelty behind the language of love and family, which made their actions even more painful. Instead of guiding with compassion, they chose humiliation, control, and public shame. If you were in Tegan's position, how would you deal with people like that? And what do you think the most just response would be?